bookshelf notes just to look at time, right? So I don't want to, that always worries me when I check my phone and I don't know that's what it's about. But I'm glad to be here. I live up in Cumming, Georgia, which means that I have to leave before dawn to get here. But it's always a great time to come down. My husband always says, just remember, we live too far away for you to want to apply there yet. Move at some point. Because I do love working with your children. I love working with these teachers. And I just think the energy here is so much about really thinking not only about teaching, but the learning impact it has for your students. Because the bottom line is that if you're a great teacher, that means your students are learning something. And that's our biggest worry, is that they learn and that what we do impacts their learning in a positive way. So I'm just thrilled to be back here. And I thought Brooke started this off very nicely talking about relationships and the relationships that we've built between Westminster teachers and myself. And part of that building a relationship is establishing some trust. So that, it's one thing to come into someone's school and then I can say whatever I want and then I get to walk out that door. They have to pick up the pieces, right? It's a whole nother thing when there's a relationship to come back to and building trust and making sure that we're both giving to the relationship and taking from the relationship. And it's the same thing with books and children. That when you're thinking about the relationship you have with your children, reading should not actually get in the way of that relationship. Okay, and I've had parents come to me when I was teaching in the classroom and saying that reading every night at home is like such a disaster at my house, and we're fighting and we're crying, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's not what reading is about. And your child will not make progress if that's going on. And so the idea of reading at home, or really the idea that reading goes with your relationships, that should help build that relationship. And because it's one part of your relationship that, if you build it, will not change when they become an adult. So a lot of things are going to change. How many of you have children that are in pre-first or first grade? Okay, anyone have fourth and fifth graders? Okay, and then the rest of you. So as the parents of anyone have teenagers? Okay, so you all know, parents of teenagers, that your darlings in pre-first and first, right, you have a relationship where they really depend on you, right? And by the time they're teenagers, they're really trying not to depend on you. And that relationship changes significantly. But when books are involved, the elementary years are prime years for you to plant seeds, to build trust about reading, that you have a reading life and that you choose great books. I'll explain why that's important later. But you're sowing these seeds, because what happens is, we notice research, people who study this, is kind of interesting, but by middle school, the amount of reading they do outside of school starts to drop off. Okay, it drops off significantly more in high school, independent reading, choice reading, and in college, even more. Okay, and the reason is, and y'all can figure this out, part of the reason is there's more extracurricular activities, there's more studying to do, there's more assigned reading to do at home, and there's, boyfriend and girlfriends. You don't want to think about that yet, but that does happen and gets in the way. So when I think about reading with our children K through 5, or pre-first through 5th, we're really thinking about, we're sowing these seeds for kids to come back to. Okay? And during those middle and high school and college years, I'm going to continue to try to sow those seeds so that when they come back to reading, hopefully they won't ever, the goal would be they would never leave it. Okay? But if in reality things get in the way and they're doing too much other type of reading to make that choice reading, that when they come back to it, they know that they also have you to come back to. So let me give you an example. When I was a kid, my parents were, of course, that was back in the day. Some of you don't even understand this, but back in the day when there was only 3 channels on TV, okay? My parents would take us to the library every week. We each had our own little Friends of the Library bag, and we each had the assignment of filling that bag with 3 books for the next week. We didn't even wait the 2 weeks. It was every Thursday night. And they would just send us off. Go find. This was a big library. I grew up in Chicago. These were big libraries. So I would wander around the children's section, and it wasn't set up as beautifully as this. It's just, there was no display, so it's just all the bookshelves. And I would just look at the bound books, and I would just walk around and walk around. And then I would choose 3 books based on cover, and a colorful cover, and win it. And I would take them home. And we'd take them out of my bag because we were required to take them out of the bag. And unless my mom read it to me, I probably didn't read those books. But at school, I was a firecracker because we had SRA kids. And I was all about being head of Michelle Platt. If she was on orange, I was on green. You know, that was my goal, is to stay ahead of her. So I read school-wise a lot. And luckily, I learned to read easily. Okay, so when we went to the library at school, there was a reading bathtub. And the rule was that the first 2 people to check out their books got to get in the reading bathtub. So imagine how I picked my books, right? I just ran to the first bookshelf. We were also assigned bookshelves, you know, because I couldn't go get the picture books. Pull out the first 2 books to get in that bathtub. But there was no time to read at school, and we weren't allowed to take our books home. Okay? Luckily at home, I was going to the library. My parents were insisting on books, but they also read to us every night. Someone read to us. When we went on car trips, this was before books on tape. There were cassette players, but they just didn't have the children's books on tape yet. My mom would read to us. And then when books on tape came, holy cow, you would have thought our family, you know, was going to have a party, because we would take 2- and 3-week car trips, because that's how we rolled. And so books on tape were what entertained us that whole time, and my mom wouldn't have to read all the time. That being said, high school, my parents kept reading, but they didn't force us to go to the library anymore. College, high school and college, I did not read outside of school at all. And came to my student teaching. My student teacher said, "What's your favorite children's book?" And I said, "I don't know, I've never read a children's book." And she's like, "You're not teaching in my classroom until you've read something." She gave me a stack of 25 books. Okay, and I was like, I was devastated. You know, I had a really high GPA. I thought I was all that, and here she was saying, "Don't even think of start teaching until you read something." And within 2 weeks, I had read all 25 books. I was amazed at these stories. And it was like Ramona. Okay? I mean, these, you know, there were Newbery classics in there, and these were books that were available when I was a child. And I called my mother. I said, "You know, if you had bought me books like this, or if there were books like this in the library, I would have read the whole time." She said, "Okay, glad to hear that you're reading now." And I went home from college, and she pulled out this huge box of books. There were about 50 or 60 books in there. And all 25 of the books, well, about half of the books that were in my stack were in that box. She said, "I did buy you those books. You just weren't ready." But then I had my first classroom library right there. Okay? But I came back to it. And my brother had a learning disability, but he loved to read. He read all the time. And now as adults, we are a family that reads. And that is what I'm trying to pass on to my children. My children are teenagers now, and the reading for school is significant amounts. The reading at home by choice is not as much. But I know that if I keep planting the seeds, this relationship, keep talking to them about books, eventually they'll come back to it. So side note, my son came last year, had to read The Odyssey by Homer. He goes, "Mom, have you ever read this book?" He goes, "I'm sure it's brand new and you might not have. You've got to read this book because it's just like Percy Jackson." And I said, "You mean Percy Jackson's just like this? Like this is an oldie, you know, like all of us have read." And I just love that he loved that book. Because who likes that book? I don't know, but it was cute. So, and I love that they'll come to me with that. So let's take a look at relationships. Fancier than my clicker. We did something start. So when we think about relationships, there has to be some joy, right, in the relationship to keep it going. Which is one of the reasons why parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers are constantly looking for fun things to do with their kids, because we need to bring joy. Little kids, we just lose joy on them, right? They just make us smile, and you're in a great time of their lives. And we want to have that joy. All relationships, we need to be available. Even like when we think about relationships with our friends. So I have a friend that we get coffee about once a week to meet and kind of catch up. And I haven't been available this week, and she keeps calling and keeps calling. And I keep deferring the phone call because the I'm working, I don't have time this week. But that idea is that all she wants is a cup of coffee to keep that relationship going, right? So trying to find ways to be available in our relationships. And if you think about all of your relationships, we make time for them, the ones that are the most important, right? We make time where we can be devoted to that person or that relationship to keep it going. And we also model. My husband and I have noticed that as our kids have started dating, that our relationship is such an incredible model for them about how they're going to handle relationships as they go off into the adult world. How we talk about work is modeling for them how they're going to handle relationships with bosses they may or may not like, how we handle our friendships, and how we handle our reading. And so we're constantly aware that even though we know that when they're younger, but when they're older and they're saying, and they're looking at trying to build their own independence, they're still looking. And so we start these 4 things with these relationships, joy, making ourselves accessible, making time and modeling in the elementary years, because you want those seeds to sow through to their adulthood. So when we're thinking about reading, it should be an enjoyable time. That is the goal. Okay. So when they're reading at home, it should be, yay, reading, not, reading. And I know some of you are like, oh yeah, good luck with that. But it should be a time where kids are excited, or that you can help them find joy in that time. All right. So thinking about reading time at your house, will kids stop when that 20-minute buzzer, if you set a buzzer, I don't always laugh when parents tell me, yeah, we have a buzzer for 20 minutes, and he'll stop at the middle of a sentence when that buzzer goes off, right? So our job today, I'm going to give you some tips about how to get, so like if the buzzer goes off, they're still reading, okay? We want to make sure that they're getting a joyful experience out of it. That is, people, all humans, only do things willingly that they like to do, right? So there's nothing wrong with helping them to like reading and to help them find joy in that, because essentially, if you help them find that joy, it will pass on through their years. We want to give them access to books. So back in the day, the library was pretty much it, right? And then the big bookstores started opening up. And my parents, when I was a teenager, and boy, that was great. They're like, oh, we'll buy you a book. Like, oh, that's great. We'll have the books at the house. We have big bookstores now. We have libraries, and we have digitally we can get hold of books. So getting kids access to books is going to be important. You already send them to a school that is so good about making sure your kids are surrounded by text. I mean, I want you to know what a great choice that is on your part as a parent. I go into schools where there might be 25 books in a classroom, and when the library is only open 3 days a week. And those are schools not necessarily in the inner city, but here in Georgia. And so the idea that you have this media, this is a beautiful library that's open even before school, right? You have an informed media specialist. You have teachers, book rooms. I mean, there's books in every room. I just walk in here and it just makes my heart sing. I'm just like, oh, I'm so happy with all these books. But it's such a gift. So thinking about your home, how do the kids have access to books outside of school? Because really, your key role in all of this is that this is a controlled environment. When they live with you, it's kind of like they're out in the wild, right? The real world. How are we going to keep them reading there? So how are you going to help them continue to have access to books? One of the things I love about Kindle is that when my kids have some favorite authors, this is one way I keep them reading once in a while, is you get a notice of pre-ordering the books. Have you noticed Amazon will do that now? I don't know, but like if you keep ordering the same author, they're like, oh, he has a book coming out in a year. And I always pre-order them. And then all of a sudden they magically appear on my kids' Kindles. They're like, oh, a little present. But their access to books is so much easier today. And text, magazines count, by the way. Reading online counts. And we want to think about what ways can we get our kids involved with text. We need to make time for them to read. Now, finding the right time is sometimes the key, right? With older students, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, they'll say, I just don't have time, because they have no time management skills, right? And, I mean, because they're in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, right? They won't have those yet. But they think, oh, I have to go home, I'll have homework, I have to eat dinner, and I have soccer practice. All of which might take an hour 2 hours, right? And they have like 4 hours after school before bedtime. So they have no sense of how much time they really have. So one of the things is, as an adult in their life is to help them figure out when would be the best time for them to read. For some kids, it will be right before bed, like that helps relax them, right? For some students, that's not the best time. Maybe it's right after school. You know, maybe it's right before dinner while you're trying to get everything together and settled. Maybe you need to practice stolen moments, which count in the sense of avid readers outside of school. They tend to find little bits of time to read. So I was noticing, and this is not a judgment, I was just noticing today that while y'all were waiting, you have like a stack of books here, and she's reading books while she's waiting. When my husband and I, when we go to the doctor or the dentist, we tell the kids, grab a book. You know, now they have their phones, and they're just like, why? The book, or I hand them a magazine. Like the idea that we can find stolen moments if we have text with us. And that those stolen moments count. And then to model. You can read in front of your children or just to let them know that you're reading, have conversations about books, asking them about their books. You don't have to be the teacher. You don't have to ask the right question, I promise. And if you just think about the conversations you have with your friends about books, those are the types of conversations you want to have with your kids. They're going to love talking about books. Once they trust that you're not going to quiz them, once they trust that you are not going to tell them they're wrong, and that you're just going to listen and have a conversation. It will make easier. Kids, when they read, are going to encounter situations that they have not encountered in their real life, especially as they start to get older. And it will allow you to have some conversations and to plug in some of your values at that time in a way that's not threatening and where it's not about your child, it's about just character. So it allows them to have an open conversation. Okay. But talking to them, modeling to them, and then also, just making you're the book advertisement. You are the advertisement of being a reader. My husband and I have this has become a joke now between us, okay? But we love doing it. Is when we go on car trips, we have a place in Florida that we drive down to. And when we drive down, the kids plug in, right? And we listen to a book on tape. And then we take a rest stop right at McDonough, which I know is way too soon, but if you've ever driven through McDonough, you just need to defrazzle. But so we get out, and we spend 5 to 10 minutes just talking all excited about this book. Like, we just can't believe it's so great, look. And we go on and on and on. And sure enough, the kids have started taking like one earplug out to listen, because they're getting to that point where they're old enough to read some of our books. But we're the advertisement for how great books are, and how much we enjoy reading. And so we try to, of course, my husband does not do it willingly. I'll just put that out there. I make him. But, we decided we are the advertisers for having a reading life. So when we think about relationships, there's an expectation of reward. There is, in any relationship, if you're not getting anything out of it, you're not going to do it. So when you think about kids and books, if they're not getting anything out of it, they're not going to do it, which is partly why people start going to other types of incentives, like pizza or going to Six Flags, which there's nothing wrong with that, except that those type of incentives won't last through their adulthood. So you want to think about other incentives as well, but pointing out how much fun or pleasure it brings, how we may get lost in a book. Notice that? Isn't it interesting how you just escape the real world and go to Hogwarts or whatever book they're reading. We read for information, and you can talk to kids about how reading helps their grades. If you have a student that would inspire them. My son wouldn't really care about that. My daughter totally cares about that. Right? So you need to think about what will your child get out of this, and keep reminding them that this is the intrinsic reward that they're getting. The idea of belonging is big, and that's pre-1st through 5th grade. When there is a book that's really high, and when my son was in 4th and 5th grade, it was the Lightning Thief series. They read it just because everyone was reading it. It's kind of like us, how many of you have queued into that Netflix thing going on, How to Make a Murderer? Everyone's talking about it. So my husband and I clicked on it and watched the first episode and the last episode. Now we feel like we're a part of it. It's harder to read a book that way, but But those are the intrinsic rewards. And if your child is not feeling those intrinsic rewards, that's one way you can help them like reading more, is start focusing